Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to number 7 in the series, The Best Sword Fighting Films of All Time. Apologies for the delay between the last film and this one. I was on holiday for 9 days in Sicily before such travel becomes prohibitively expensive and unfeasible, and unfortunately did not have the facilities to make a video while I was away, or indeed the inclination. Speaking of Europe, this is the first French film on the list, which will no doubt please my many French friends and even frenemies. It is also the first film on the list which has fight choreography by the unparalleled and sorely missed Bill Hobbs. As we can see here, such was the high regard in which Bill was held by the filmmakers, he was one of the few non-main acting members of the crew to be given credit in the beginning titles of the film. As you can therefore probably tell, this is a more modern film than the last one in the series, Captain Blood, and I can keep you in suspense no longer. It is in fact Cyrano de Bergerac. Cyrano de Bergerac was a verse play written at the very end of the 19th century by Edmond Rostand, and if you're looking for a version of the film which has a happy ending and is filmed entirely in English, then you could check out Roxanne, starring Steve Martin. However, it is not exactly the same as the original play. This film, on the other hand, is closer to the extent that it is even largely told in verse. Rarely have I had such a strong desire to show the whole film, since it is poetry from start to finish, and rarely in fact does poetry move me more than well-crafted, intelligent prose, but herein lies the exception. But I must resist. As with my previous videos, I will talk a little about the story as a whole and the characters therein. Although there are quite a few sword fights in the film, at least half of them are melees in battle situations, and there's not so much sword fighting to talk about in terms of the choreography and the technique in a sort of more dueling or one-on-one or one-on-several context, which again leaves me room to talk about the characters perhaps and the story a little more. The lead is Gérard Depardieu playing Cyrano de Bergerac, and it is an incredible performance, conveying the tortured nature of the character, the strange contrast of his reputation as a terror with a sword, with a violent temper, against someone who is in fact, at heart, a sensitive, poetic character.
Ce n'est qui d'un quart d'heure en tout lieu me précède, alors moi j'aime qui? Mais cela va de soi.
Anne Brochet plays Roxanne, the woman that he loves.
De sorte qu'elle est prête et que mettant mon âme à côté du papier, je n'ai tout simplement qu'à la recopier. Je suis entre vos mains. Ce papier, c'est ma voix. Cette encre, c'est mon sang. Cette lettre, c'est moi.
And is also loved by Vincent Perez's character, Christian, who, unlikely as it seems, Cyrano helps in his pursuit of Roxanne. Christian's character being a man of action, of few words, brave, and, as we see early on, caring of his friends, but not someone who could stir the passions of anyone with the poetry of his words.
Où sont-ils? À la porte de Nesle.
If there's one scene which would explain the story in its entirety, it is this one here, which I've in fact cut down even from its original length.
Dites la chose qu'en entrant vous n'osiez pas dire.
À présent j'ose, car le passé m'encourageait de son parfum. Oui, j'ose maintenant. Voilà, j'aime quelqu'un qui ne le sait pas d'ailleurs. Pas encore, mais qui va bientôt le savoir s'il l'ignore. Un pauvre garçon qui jusqu'ici m'aima timidement, de loin, sans oser le dire. Laissez-moi votre main, voyant là la fièvre. Mais moi j'ai vu trembler les aveux sur sa lèvre. Et figurez-vous, tenez que... Justement, oui, mon cousin. Il sert de votre régiment. Puisqu'il est cadet dans votre compagnie. Il a sur son front de l'esprit, du génie. Il est fier, noble, jeune, intrépide, beau.
Beau?
Quoi qu'avez-vous?
Moi? Rien. C'est... C'est ce bobo. Vous vous êtes parlé?
Jamais.
Il est cadet?
Cadet aux gardes, oui.
Son nom, vous le savez?
C'est le baron Christian de Neuvillette.
Hein? Il n'est pas au cadet.
Si, depuis ce matin. Oui, j'ai très peur pour lui.
Non sans raison.
Mais j'ai songé en vous voyant hier tenant tête à ces brutes. Vous, invincible et grand tel que toujours vous fûtes. J'ai songé, s'il voulait, lui, que tous ils craindront.
C'est bien. Je défendrai votre petit baron.
Oh, n'est-ce pas que vous allez me le défendre? J'ai toujours eu pour vous une amitié si tendre.
Oui, oui,
Vous serez son ami?
je le saurai.
Et jamais il n'aura de duel?
C'est juré.
Oh, je vous aime bien. Il faut que je m'en aille. Mais vous ne m'avez pas raconté la bataille de cette nuit. Vraiment, ce dut être inouï. Dites-lui qu'il m'écrive. Oh, je vous aime.
Oui, oui.
100 hommes contre vous. Allons, adieu. Nous sommes de grands amis.
Oui, oui.
Qu'il m'écrive. 100 hommes. Vous me direz plus tard, maintenant je ne puis. 100 hommes, quel courage.
Oh,
I've been braver
c'est mieux
since
depuis.
then. The romance in Cyrano de Bergerac's character is not simply confined to his unrequited love for Roxanne. There is one scene which perhaps describes his philosophy most clearly in the film, although at this point somewhat tinged with bitterness because of his frustration and his failure to express his feelings to Roxanne.
Eh bien oui, c'est mon vice. Déplaire est mon plaisir, j'aime qu'on me haïsse.
Si tu laissais un peu ton âme mousquetaire, la fortune et la gloire...
Et que faudrait-il faire? Chercher un protecteur puissant? Prendre un patron? Et comme un lierre obscur qui circonvient un tronc et s'en fait un tuteur en lui léchant l'écorce? Grimper par ruse au lieu de s'élever par force? Non, merci. Léger, comme tous ils le font, des vers aux financiers, se changer en bouffon dans l'espoir vil de voir aux lèvres d'un ministre naître un sourire enfin qui ne soit pas sinistre? Non, merci. Déjeuner chaque jour d'un crapaud, avoir un ventre usé par la marche, une peau qui plus vite à l'endroit des genoux devient sale, exécuter des tours de souplesse dorsale? Non, merci. De trouver du talent comme Mazette, être terrorisé par de vagues casettes et se dire sans cesse « Oh, pourvu que je sois dans les petits papiers du Mercure, François !» Non, merci. Calculer, avoir peur, être blême, aimer mieux faire une visite qu'un poème, rédiger des placés, se faire présenter. Non, merci. Non, merci. Non, merci.
Mais chanter, rêver, rire, passer, être seul, être libre, avoir l'œil qui regarde bien, la voix qui vibre, mettre quand il vous plaît son feutre de travers pour un oui, pour un non, se battre ou faire un vers. Travailler sans souci de gloire ou de fortune à tel voyage auquel on pense. Dans la lune, triomphant par hasard, en garder le mérite, bref, dédaignant d'être le lierre parasite lors même qu'on n'est pas le chêne ou le tilleul. Ne pas monter bien haut, peut-être, mais tout seul.
As I mentioned previously, it is incredibly tempting to try and show the entire film, and of course I shouldn't do that because I'm only meant to be, or only intending to, review the sword fighting primarily, with a little bit of an overview of the plot and the characters. I would strongly recommend anyone who's not seen this film to go and watch it. The end is particularly tragic and heart-wrenching, and in fact, I will be showing the end scene because it does overlap with fighting, even though I tend to steer clear of making such obvious spoilers for a film to actually show the end scenes themselves. But in this instance, I felt I had to show it. One, because for a large chunk of it, he does have a sword in his hand, but two, the final lines, and the final line in particular, are just so beautiful, I had to leave it in place. That said, I think enough of the background has been covered here for me to now begin to talk about the fight scenes as they occur in the film. The first fight is a brilliant marriage between the art of the fight choreographer and that of the actors, and of course the director as well. As usual, I will show the scene in its entirety first, then explain more afterwards. But I will say first, as with several other scenes in this film, this scene individually somehow seems to capture the essence of the entire story, a tale which is at once comedic yet also tragic. It turns from a clever dance, almost a celebration of vitality and life, to the brutal brawl and horror of death.
Maraud, faquin, butor de pied plat ridicule.
Ah, et moi, Cyrano Savinien, Hercule de Bergerac. Bouffon. Aïe!
Qu'est-ce encore qu'il dit?
Il faut la remuer, car elle s'engourdit. Ce que c'est que de la laisser inoccupée. Aïe! Qu'avez-vous? J'ai des fourmis dans mon épée.
Soit.
Elle aime ce bruit presque passionnément.
Poète?
Oui, monsieur poète. Et tellement qu'en ferraillant, je vais, hop, à l'improvisade, vous composer une ballade.
Une balade?
Et vous touchez, monsieur, au dernier vers.
Non.
Non? Ballade du duel. Quand l'hôtel Bourguignon, monsieur de Bergerac eut avec un bel ivre.
Qu'est-ce que c'est que ça, s'il vous plaît?
C'est le titre.
Non, taisez-vous! Écoutez! Pas de bruit!
Attendez, je choisis mes rimes. Là, j'y suis. Je jette avec grâce mon feutre. Je fais lentement l'abandon du grand manteau qui me calfeutre. Et je tire mon espadon. Élégant comme Céladon, agile comme Scaramouche. Je vous préviens, cher Myrmidon, qu'à la fin de l'envoi, je touche. Vous auriez bien dû rester neutre. Où vais-je vous larder, dindon? Dans le flanc, sous votre maheutre, au cœur, sous votre bleu cordon. Les coquilles teintes. Ding dong. Ma pointe voltige une mouche. Décidément, c'est au bedon qu'à la fin de l'envoi, je touche. Il me manque une rime en neutre. On paye plus blanc qu'un bidon, c'est pour me fournir le mot bleutre. Tac, je pars la pointe, donc vous espériez me faire don. J'ouvre la ligne, je la bouche. Tiens bien ta broche, Laridon, à la fin de l'envoi, je touche. Envoie. Prince demande à Dieu pardon, je carte du pied. J'escarmouche, je coupe, je crache. Et là, à la fin de l'envoi, je touche.
The first half of the fight, Cyrano de Bergerac is annoyed by the foppish noble who's attempting to insult him and provoke him, but he also clearly doesn't see him as a serious sort of threat, and initially he just tears him to pieces verbally by listing endlessly the various different ways in which the noble could have insulted him if he'd had the wits to do so, instead of simply saying, "Your nose is big," which is what he did do. And of course, in doing this, he flips the entire situation round on this noble. The noble himself becomes insulted and enraged, and eventually is provoked himself to draw his weapon and to start a duel. And yet, at all points, Cyrano obviously has full control. He doesn't really seem motivated by anger at all. He's motivated by annoyance, but seeks to deal with the situation with intelligence and with a measure of reserve. After tearing him apart verbally, he now continues to tear him apart verbally, while simultaneously precisely, picking him apart with the sword, not actually wounding him, simply defending himself with such obvious ease and style and grace that it is clear that he's merely toying with this noble. And the whole thing is done with great humour and wit, of course the things which the noble lacks. And it is after Cyrano has essentially finished the duel, as far as he's concerned, disarming the noble, that things turn sour. The noble is now utterly embarrassed, and rage and vengeance completely overcome him. He, in a rather cowardly way, goes after his discarded weapon and runs at the back of Cyrano de Bergerac, who is essentially undefended, or at least not looking at the noble, who's now running to basically stab him in the back. At this point, although Cyrano does hear him approaching and defends himself, the fight is no longer an exercise in demonstrating swordplay. It is an out-and-out brutal brawl, a rage-fueled and unruly combat. The choreography reflects this perfectly. The first half is beautiful and precise and comic timing mixed with excellent swordplay. The second half is just Cyrano and the noble beating at each other with the hands, beating each other with the handles, falling over, being pushed over. It is a complete scrap. And the final action, in which the noble essentially impales himself. I mean, he's knocked Cyrano over. Cyrano still has his weapon in hand and simply has to bring up the weapon in front of him while the noble runs on in such rage that he doesn't realize that he's too close and walks straight, or runs straight onto Cyrano's weapon, which terminates the fight in a most abrupt and yet realistic way. Here we see one of the most subtle and poignant parts of the fight, which demonstrate the fight choreography and the acting coming together seamlessly. After Cyrano has run through his opponent, he pulls the blade free, but does so in quite a swift action, not one that actually twists the blade around or designed to cause more injury. It's actually to remove the blade as quickly as possible. And as his opponent, the noble, falls to his knee, Cyrano actually reaches out very briefly towards him with his hand in a clearly sympathetic and entirely unconscious action of sympathy towards this now wounded, possibly dying man. And this one tiny action, this one fraction of a second of acting, reveals a huge amount about the character of Cyrano de Bergerac. He isn't just a crazed dueler. He isn't just an insane squabbler and scrapper. He had a point to make when he started this fight, and he did not want it to end this way. And he actually feels sympathy for his fellow man. All of this in one tiny gesture of the hand. So as I said earlier, this scene sums up both the character of Cyrano and, in a way, the essence of the entire story. The comedy, the tragedy, all mixed together in life. In fact, of course, this is supposed to be a reflection of life itself from the perspective of the author. Bill Hobbs was one of the best choreographers at actually making the characters come through in the sword fighting. That each person, in many films that he's done, their style reflected their personality. They were also realistically fighting, sword fighting, but with a style that was appropriate to their psychology, that their thought processes, that their impulses, their instincts, based upon the characters, came through in the swordplay. This is often more evident in other films. There are fewer characters in which you can see this in this film, but Cyrano's swordplay in this fight reflects his wit, his intelligence, his control. He's not a rage-filled beast. He is a witty, intelligent, and on some level, fundamentally caring human being. And it's strange to say that in the context of a sword fight, but this does seem to come through in the way he conducts himself in this fight, as opposed to the noble, who is a blustering, overblown, overconfident, and ultimately brutish and skillless individual, and in the end is the manufacturer of his own demise. One final thing I will note at this point is that if this film seems eerily reminiscent of The Three Musketeers, well, it is largely set in Paris, and it's set for the most part in 1640, and Richelieu, Cardinal Richelieu, is still alive. In fact, it's about 12 years more or less after the setting of The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. Alexandre Dumas, of course, had a fantastic eye for historical detail, and I think Eben Rostand shares that same eye for historical accuracy and the events that were unfolding at the time. So it is not unusual that they both seem familiar or reminiscent of each other. Both, of course, are classics. Before I move on to the second fight scene, I'd like to talk a bit about how sword fighting movies such as this interact and bleed into my own fencing. The reason I talk about this now is because since recording yesterday, I have subsequently today been fencing before starting to record today's section, and I noticed something odd, if not unusual, about the fencing today. Yesterday I stayed up quite late recording, and so today I was more tired than I really should be if I'm going to fence at my best. In addition, I went swimming yesterday, which left me even more tired and stiff than I might otherwise have been. Plus, actually, recording after swimming and sitting with not perhaps the most healthy posture left me even stiffer than I might have been anyway. All this said, I knew that today I would not be fencing very well, and yet, somewhat unexpectedly, I did fence reasonably well. Part of this was because I was thinking constantly about the last fight scene from Cyrano de Bergerac, and something of the style, the intelligence, the wit, the humour, the subtlety of Cyrano's fencing was bleeding into my own style. Now, this is not entirely without precedent. In the past, I have used music from films such as The Seahawk to get me into a mood where I'm more enthusiastic about fencing before a competition, for example. And similarly, if I'm not feeling particularly sparky or enthusiastic, I will often remember and even imagine I'm in the sword fight from The Prisoner of Zenda. This may seem an odd choice, given it's in fact a saber fight and I fence épée, but it's more the banter and the wit and the back and forth, the humour, coupled with what is still a fight in earnest, that really puts me into a good place usually when I'm thinking about fencing, where I want to fence and I want to be in the right mindset. So it's not entirely unexpected that watching the fight scene from Cyrano de Bergerac would affect my fencing in such a way. And to be fair, my own style tends to be flavoured with a certain amount of humour. I tend to at least present an impression of having fun while fencing, and in fact that's not exactly a pretense. I am having fun and I do laugh quite a lot when I'm fencing, which can get me into trouble sometimes because some people don't realise why I'm laughing. I'm not actually laughing at my opponent ever. I'm always laughing at some mutually idiotic situation that we've both ended up in at some point in the fight usually, or I'm laughing at my own idiocy. People who know me and people who also are aware at a high level of what's been going on in our fight never take offence because they also know the humour of the situation. The only time it really causes a problem is when I'm fencing somebody who is less aware, both self-aware or indeed aware of the fight to the fullest degree, i.e. they're missing the comedy of the situation. So that said, it was not entirely unexpected that watching Cyrano's fight scene repeatedly had left me in a mentally actually quite good state to fence, even though physically I was a complete wreck. And so we come to the second fight in the film. At this point, before showing it in its entirety, I will just remind you of two things. This film was made in 1990. This is 1 year after Tim Burton's original first Batman movie in 1989. That's all I'm going to say. Now watch the clip. So, you get it? Wait, are you saying that just because he leapt from the sky wearing a cape into the middle of a vast number of villains, in the middle of the night, in the mist and the dimness, and you think this is just like Batman? No. It is not just that he leapt down from the sky in a similar setting, dressed in a cape that I think is like Batman. I started the clip before the fight for a reason, for the music. The music itself is very reminiscent of Danny Elfman's Batman theme for the original Batman movie. But it is not just that either. It is the combination of the music plus the aesthetic, the night fight, the multiple villains, the mist, the far more comic book portrayal of this mass melee of 100 versus Cyrano. It is superhero-like, and I do think there is a strong possibility that there was a deliberate attempt on the part of the filmmakers to evoke the aesthetic of Batman. In fact, they may even, and I'm reaching here, but they may even have felt there was some parallel between the two characters, these heroic but uncompromising, tragic heroes, both Batman, with his various tragedies, the loss of his family included, and his uncompromising war against villainy and falsehood and cruelty and baseness, is definitely strongly echoed in the character of Cyrano de Bergerac, who has a similar war against cowardice and falsehood and any kind of base behaviour at the core of his character. As for the sword fight itself, there is not much to say in terms of sword fighting, as it is much more an exercise in athleticism and acrobatics, as Cyrano leaps around, throwing his opponents all over the place. Yes, he's stabbing them, but it is much less clearly defined as a sword fight as the first one, and so it does leave me with less to say in terms of the fencing, but it is an incredible scene. The next two fight scenes are very short but sweet. They are both sweeping shots of the musketeers, or the guards, in training, and you actually get to see a really nice diversity of styles of combat as it sweeps across the room. In both cases, both these scenes are eerily reminiscent of an earlier film in which Bill Hobbs was the fight director. In fact, I'm thinking of the 1973 The Three Musketeers. There is a scene where D'Artagnan first comes to join the musketeers, and he walks through almost exactly the same type of scene, and in fact, as he walks out again, you can still see much of this action going on the way out of the building. So this first fight scene is the guards at training just prior to Cyrano de Bergerac turning up, having fought 100 men, but also failed to tell Roxane that he loves her because she stopped him unintentionally by telling him of her love for Christian. And now the second training fight scene, or the fourth fight scene overall. And this second scene of training is perhaps the most reminiscent of the Three Musketeers scene. Obviously, the composition of shots in a film are not the responsibility of the fight choreographer. They are the director's responsibility, and to some degree, of course, the screenwriter as well. Nevertheless, I'm sure the director was aware of Bill Hobbs' prior work. Almost certainly this is why he was hired. And I would be fairly certain they knew about the scenes in the Three Musketeers in great detail. And I suspect the scene is directly inspired by that scene, at least in composition, although it probably also occurs in the play itself. I would not be surprised if there was some more direct inspiration from one film to the next, because this is the scene where Christian first arrives at the guards to join, or to be introduced for the first time, and it is similar, only there is more focus on Christian in this case. D'Artagnan just walks through to the office of the commander of the guards, the musketeers I should say, whereas Christian is seen by all of the cadets as he walks in, and the action beautifully stops in a wave as he walks through the room until they're all finally focused on him, and they're preparing to give him a welcome, in this case a hazing essentially, which of course he deals with a certain level of bravery. The next fight occurs after the cadets, including Christian and Cyrano de Bergerac as one of the senior guards, who were initially besieging the Spanish, have now become besieged themselves by the Spanish army. Because of this, they are starving, as they've been cut off from supplies, and Christian and a couple of the others decide to go and steal food from the Spanish themselves. They've all but successfully pulled off their raid for food without being discovered when Christian hears a scream, and it's Roxane. Roxane has been secretly trying to reach them because obviously she wants to be with her love, Christian, and was captured by the Spanish just after Christian successfully made his raid. So we see Christian rescues Roxanne in what is more a food fight with some gunfire than a sword fight, but there is a bit of sword action in there, so I felt I had to include it. The next two fights have a similar problem to a couple of the fight scenes in Captain Blood, in that they are melees, and yes, there is some sword work going on, but it is basically a large battle with many different actions going on simultaneously, actions overlaying each other, different weapons being used. There's not much to analyse, except to say that they both highlight the horrors of war in these most close quarters and personal of combats. It is all hand to hand, it is all visceral and appalling and horrific, and both scenes show this very well. The first scene is the one in which Christian is mortally wounded. The second scene is where the battle is turning ever worse and the cadets are being completely overrun by the Spanish. In fact, at the end of the scene, you're not entirely sure who, if anyone, has survived. One standout point in the second of these melee battle scenes is the point where Cyrano de Bergerac ends up back-to-back with the Comte de Guiche. Now, the Comte de Guiche is someone who previously had seen Cyrano as a rival, or at least an obstruction, to his own attempts to seduce Roxanne. Not only an obstruction in that he is the cousin of Roxanne and acts as her protector, but also it becomes clear to the Comte de Guiche later that Cyrano is helping Christian in his pursuit of Roxanne, and so further is annoyed and irritated by Cyrano's continued obstruction of his own plans. The scene where they end up back-to-back in this fight is particularly moving in that both characters are in the heat of battle, and the need to protect each other as fellow soldiers, as people working together on the same side, trumps whatever rivalries and irritations they had felt up until this point. And Cyrano defends the Comte by pulling him out of the way of an incoming attack and takes on that same soldier. Meanwhile, the Comte de Guiche is essentially performing the same action behind Cyrano, defending his back. They're literally covering each other's backs. And this actually is a turning point for their relationship in terms of the entire film. From here on in, the Comte de Guiche clearly has some liking or respect for Cyrano and actually wants to prevent him getting harmed or injured later on as well, later on in their lives. And I can imagine that Cyrano also has more respect for the Comte de Guiche, particularly because he came back when he did leave the fray, the battle initially, and threw himself into this battle, even refusing to take leftover food and preferring to fight on an empty stomach. His bravado wins him respect of both the Gascon cadets and Cyrano as well, I suspect. And now we come to the final fight scene in the film, and indeed the final scene of the film. So if you don't want the film spoiling entirely and don't want to see the end of the film now, I would skip on to beyond this scene and beyond me talking about it. I'll put a timestamp in the description so you can do that.
Elle vient. Je me sens déjà botté de marbre, ganté de plomb. Oh. Mais puisqu'elle est en chemin, j'irai à sa rencontre, et l'épée à la main. Que dites-vous? C'est inutile. Je le sais. Mais on ne se bat pas dans l'espoir du succès, non, non. C'est bien plus beau lorsque c'est inutile. Qu'est-ce que c'est que tout cela?
Vous êtes 1000. Ah, je vous reconnais. Tous mes vieux ennemis. Le mensonge, les lâchetés, les compromis. Je sais bien qu'à la fin, vous me mettrez à bas, n'importe. Je me bats, je me bats, je me bats. Oh, oui, vous m'arrachez tout. Le laurier et la rose, arrachés. Il y a malgré vous quelque chose que j'emporte. Ce soir, quand j'entrerai chez Dieu, mon salut balayera largement le seuil bleu. Quelque chose que sans un pli, sans une tache, j'emporte malgré vous. Et c'est mon panache.
And so, Cyrano essentially has been assassinated by trickery. A beam has been dropped on his head by assassins in a cowardly manner in a back street, and although he is still alive, he knows that the injury will eventually claim his life, and yet he still staggers for his appointed regular meeting with Roxanne. And here, Roxanne finally realizes that the love letters that were written and claimed to be from Christian were in fact all written by Cyrano de Bergerac, and she realizes that it was he that she loved all along. His personality, his soul, that was coming through in the letters. It is a tragic scene of awful loss and unfulfilled promise. Even Cyrano himself claims that he has mucked everything up, even his own death, that he has not lived up to his own standards in many ways. And the fight illustrates his fight against things that he considers beneath him. And so we see him walking bravely towards death, sword in hand, cutting at abstract foes which are concepts, falsehood, cowardice, compromise, the things that he would never wish to entertain, although in some ways he has fallen foul of them in the way that he interacted with Roxanne, in the way that he was never honest with her until this final moment. It is incredibly sad as a final scene, and from a personal perspective is something that I myself in recent years have tried, I may not always succeed, to always tell those I care about exactly how I feel about them before it is too late. The final line that he utters, that he takes one thing with him that cannot be stolen from him, even if he has lost the laurels of credit for his poetry, or the rose, his love, the one thing he takes with him is his panache. The play itself is credited as introducing the word panache to the English language, that before it hadn't really cropped up in English dialogue or in use. And of course panache meaning a dashing or flamboyant manner, and this is certainly Cyrano. From one end to the other, he is dashing and flamboyant. He is a great hero, a tragic, a flawed hero, but one that you can admire on many levels. The play itself is a beautiful marriage of comedy and tragedy. It has both these elements in equal measure. And I think with many films that feature higher up my list, this is something that elevates a film beyond run-of-the-mill storytelling. It is a challenge to write a story that can be both humorous and funny, and yet at the same time tragic and deeply saddening. And this is why I think Cyrano de Bergerac deserves to be on this list, and it deserves to be where it is on this list. And so, this brings us to the end of number 7 on the best sword fighting films of all time. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you again on number 6 of the best sword fighting films of all time. Take care.